Welcome to Mom Breaks. In this episode, you'll hear Trisha's experience with bipolar disorder and postpartum psychosis. Trisha was diagnosed with bipolar during her second pregnancy, which ended with a traumatic birth experience, including hemorrhaging, developing sepsis, and nearly dying. When she later became pregnant with her third child, she navigated treating bipolar while growing a tiny human to full term and developed postpartum psychosis before her baby arrived. In our conversation, Trisha shares what it was like to navigate pregnancy with her bipolar diagnosis, as well as her experience with lithium and other medications, and some difficult repercussions from the experience. She shares candidly about her experiences with some domestic abuse, so want to give a clear trigger warning at the outset. This episode has discussion of self-harm and domestic abuse, so please take care as you listen. As a reminder, we are survivors sharing lived experiences. We're discussing our experiences. We are not clinicians. Please consult your provider if you have any questions that come up and if you're wondering about changing anything about your treatment plan. With that, let's turn to Trisha's story.
All right. Okay. Well, I'd love to start off just getting to know you as a whole person.
Sure.
Tell me about yourself.
I am a mother to 3 children. They are ages 11, 10, and 7. I'm non-custodial. They live with their father. I lost custody after the postpartum psychosis happened. So postpartum psychosis happened when my youngest was born. So that would have been 2017 at this point, November 2017. I've never lived with her. I had her. They gave her to me for a few minutes when I was in the delivery room, and then I saw her for a few minutes in the nursery, and then I was transferred to a psychiatric ward, and when I got out of the psychiatric ward, they'd already gone. Now, a lot of that comes down to what my ex-husband did at that time and choices he made, and it gets messy, but I've not had custody since then. So these days, my visitation schedule is every 2 weeks, I get 2 hours with my children in a supervised visitation center. Once in a while, my parents will get to visit them, or they'll visit my parents because it's still good to visit their grandparents, but they actually live with my ex-husband moved in with his parents when he left. So they live with their grandparents on that side with my ex-husband, and it's not ideal to me, but they're also surrounded by a bunch of their cousins and stuff, and they're happy. So however frustrating things are on this end, it's really what matters to me. They're happy, they're healthy, mostly healthy. My oldest daughter has cancer.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
She's okay. She's in remission. So they have her on this sort of long-term, low-dose chemo treatment that is supposed to keep it from coming back. It did already come back once, so that's why they've got her on this experimental protocol now. But she's happy, and chemo, they've done a good deal in the last 30 years to make chemo not suck so badly. But children are also very resilient. The only thing I really noticed with the chemo was that she was a little tired sometimes, not terribly. Couldn't stand to eat chocolate. She said apparently it tasted metallic. So if the worst thing was that she wasn't going to eat chocolate, I think that was okay from my perspective. Yeah, so that's my kids. I'm divorced. That divorce happened after the postpartum psychosis. I have not remarried. It'd be nice to remarry one of these days, but knowing what I know, that changes the game, so to speak. And I'm 39, so I'm getting a little bit older. It's a little bit harder at this point.
I mean, there's always a person out there.
I hope so. I'd like to think there is. But I'm also a conservative Catholic, so that's what takes up most of my time these days. I do a lot of work at church. I hang out a lot at church, and it's a good thing. I like it, and they've been really supportive. Almost all of them know that I did have postpartum psychosis. There isn't a single person that's really judged me for it. It's not a diagnosis you really talk about a whole lot. There is a stigma. There's a very, very real stigma attached to it because usually in media portrayals, the examples we see of postpartum psychosis are
scary.
The really scary ones. Absolutely. Andrea Yates, that whole case took place in my hometown.
Wow, really?
Yeah. So that was my first exposure to postpartum psychosis when I
Oh
was young.
dear.
So, like when the thought of postpartum psychosis, like when it was first floated as a diagnosis, I was like, what? No,
Oh,
no,
wow. It's
that's not possible. No,
interesting.
I didn't
Did
kill anyone.
you
All right, quick note for anyone who's not familiar with Andrea Yates. She is an American who, back in 2001, drowned her 5 children while navigating a series of severe mental illness, including postpartum psychosis. She had a history of mental health struggles starting in her teenage years, a history of hospitalizations and multiple suicide attempts, had been advised not to have more children, and was also not cleared to be alone with her kids at the time of the incident. She was initially convicted of capital murder. Years later, her conviction was overturned, and in 2006, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and that was through the consult of perinatal psychiatric experts who helped deblur and better understand her mental condition at the time. Today, she remains in a state hospital, and her case continues to shape how we talk about perinatal mental illness and the justice system. So, with that, let's get back to Trisha.
I mean, that case garnered national attention. And before it garnered national attention, it exploded within the local community. So even though I was very young at the time, when you talk to kids about that sort of thing, you tend to soften it, right? I probably grew up with a different understanding of what's postpartum psychosis. I mean, I at least knew what it was, even if it was a very distorted
Right.
view of what things were. But
Yeah.
there was something just being able to name it and say that, oh, we have a diagnosis. When we have a diagnosis, then at least we have a possibility of treatment. And when we have a diagnosis, it's not just me going completely bonkers. At least there's a clinical explanation for this.
Right.
And so, as much as the stigma was something I was well aware of, at least having a name to put on it was actually rather useful. My ex-husband, and this may have had something to do with the dynamic of our relationship, he made a really big deal of saying that I needed to find my agency in everything. I need to find my agency. Then it becomes how much of this was my fault? How much free will did I really have in everything that happened? And once the postpartum psychosis diagnosis was actually given, diagnoses aren't really that useful sometimes. I mean, they're mostly tools to help us go one way or another. That's all they are. But having that diagnostic label almost kind of vindicated me from thinking, oh, this was all me. This was something wrong with me. It was, yeah, there is something wrong with me, but not in the fundamentally wrong with me. Now I understand I'm sick. I was very
Right.
sick. I needed help. There is help to be found. Might be a little long-winded and painful help, but it's there. Over the years, the one thing I realized was that the experience I had was actually extraordinarily atypical. I knew about postpartum psychosis myself. I never thought that that was what was going on because the onset wasn't postpartum. And it wasn't really until my psychiatrist was kind of looking at everything after the fact that she was like, this looks like postpartum psychosis, and it just happened to have a peripartum onset. So it wasn't a true postpartum onset. Most of it was in labor. And then by the time the baby was born, most of the symptoms were gone. There were some residual symptoms, and by the time I was out of the psychiatric ward, the symptoms had abated completely, which, as I later learned, that's not always the case. I mean, I was there for 1 week and that was it. I know that there are people who end up staying for much longer or who have to have continual treatment after they leave acute psychiatric treatment. So I'm grateful for whatever it was that kind of limited the span or the scope of the damage, but it also just makes me wonder because there's so much, like at first, when my psychiatrist was saying this is postpartum psychosis, I was like, that doesn't look like postpartum psychosis to me because,
It was before.
well, there was that. And then it was also well, there was this doesn't fit the like what I thought of like the Andrea Yates model, right? There was that, and there was it happened really before the baby was born, and it resolved so fast. I mean, now maybe a conflating part in there was that I was on lithium. I was on other antipsychotics. I've been under psychiatric care since I was 15. I think possibly the reason it resolved, or a factor in the reason of it resolving as early as it did, was I already had treatment going on. Maybe it was an issue of the treatment didn't work as well when I was pregnant. The treatment didn't work as well when I was in labor. Hormones do all sorts of weird, funky things. And once that was over, then, lithium's a very powerful drug. As far as mood stabilizers go, the gold standard is still lithium. It's old. It has some drawbacks to it. You have to do a lot of blood monitoring. The doses of lithium that we use for mood stabilization are borderline toxic, but as long as it's carefully administered and carefully taken, and you have a good relationship with the doctor who's prescribing it, lithium can be amazing stuff, really.
Yeah. So you started feeling symptoms at the start of your labor. Is lithium
Right.
something you take daily?
Yes.
Okay.
Almost all of these are things that you take daily.
Was your labor quick? Do you remember if lithium, like you had forgotten while you're in labor?
That becomes something that gets a little bit hairy too. Lithium is fine for fetuses, but lithium is horrible for neonates. One of the challenges for neonatologists and for psychiatrists who attend to pregnant women is they will usually recommend tapering down and off the lithium close to the delivery date or the due date, but the due dates are always estimations anyway.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, like it's all a bit of a game. If you taper it off too early, then you're going to be dealing with an issue where you don't have mood stabilization when you really need it. If you taper it off too late, you're going to have lithium in a neonate, which, can cause, you get blue baby syndrome with lithium in babies when they're first born. They tend to be a little on the weak side. It's not terrible, but it's a complication. It means that you need to have neonatology in there. They usually end up in the NICU for a while.
All right, Meg jumping in here again as the novice that I am around the topic of lithium. I've learned that lithium is a naturally occurring substance in the earth. It's something found as a natural salt and something that we ingest from dietary sources. There are some studies that suggest that there's some type of association between exposure to lithium through sources like drinking water and decreased suicide rates at a macro scale. These are correlations, not causations, but I didn't realize that lithium is something that we're exposed to. Of course, when we are taking it as a medication, these are much higher doses and it does have a narrow range of safety. So it doesn't take much to have too much lithium in your body, and you could have symptoms of toxicity if the dosage is off. I am not a perinatal psychiatrist and hope to bring one on here soon to be able to speak to this. One other thing I noted in looking into this is that apparently some recent recommendation shows that maybe it's possible to continue lithium through labor and delivery. Again, hopefully we can get a perinatal psychiatrist on here to be able to speak to that soon. All right, back to Trisha.
With my second child, with my son, I was already taking lithium then. The difference was, even with the lithium, I had so bad of antepartum depression and antepartum mixed states. That's when I actually first got the bipolar diagnosis, was when I was pregnant with my son. And the lithium helped, but not enough. And because just the psychiatric symptoms were so bad when I was pregnant, the solution the doctors came up with was induce this baby at 37 weeks and 0, get him out. Once he's out, then we can actually treat the psychiatric conditions the way they need to be treated. 37 and 0, the baby is term, early term.
Yeah.
Term. I'd had one healthy child prior to that. So they weren't seeing any complications from any of the prenatal screens. And so it made sense from their perspective, and it made sense from mine. Okay, if the pregnancy is causing this much of a problem, get the baby out as soon as we can, as soon as it's safe to do so. That'll give us the leeway to actually work on mom.
With your third baby, did they
They let
decide
her
not?
go to term because I nearly died in delivery with my second.
Ah, what?
It was perfectly safe for the baby to be born at 37 and 0. The problem is inductions get messy. And so I ended up being in labor for like 26 and a half hours. And then after the 26 and a half hours, I was bleeding out. They had to take me to like emergency surgery because they had to do a manual retrieval. And I only found this out, like after the fact. I was so far out of it. I lost enough blood that they needed to give me 2 units when I was still in the hospital. And then after I was discharged, I went home. I kind of felt, kind of like, well, out of it, probably because I just had a baby. Fine. My husband and I came down with the same fever on the same day.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, okay, I was just in a hospital. We've got opportunistic infections. I just, like had a baby. No big deal. And then a couple days later, he was getting better and I wasn't. And again, I'm like, well, just had a baby. I'm immunosuppressed. No big deal. I'm not nursing because of the lithium. So then, okay, maybe there's mastitis that causes fevers too. No big deal. And we didn't have a thermometer. And I guess by the time we finally bought a thermometer and took my temperature, it was up to 103. And so I was like, oh, okay, it's probably just mastitis. Let me call the doctor. I'll make an appointment. It'll be no big deal. And my husband was like, no, we're going to go to the ER and you can call the doctor on the way. And that started like a 2 week period where apparently I was going septic. So probably, was it because of the induction? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, puerperal sepsis happens. It's maternal death is on the rise, unfortunately, and part of it is because we have babies so much later than we used to, and so we have higher risk pregnancies to begin with. But sepsis has always been a risk.
Okay, so that was your.
That was my
That sounds like a
second.
lot. That was your second birth
But
experience.
because of everything that had happened with the second child, with my third child, they didn't want to induce her. They don't want me to go through all that again. I almost died from first the hemorrhage and then the sepsis. So let's not risk that. So they let the third go to full term and just let me go into labor. The problem was, I want to say I was off lithium entirely by the time I actually went into labor. It's hard to say because it's really tricky to call the timing because my first child was born 38 and 6. So she was 1 week and 1 day early. And obviously you can't really count the induction because that was an
Right.
artificial thing. But
Indeed.
knowing that my first child was born 1 week and 1 day early, it was a pretty safe call to go slightly early on the lithium being pulling back than to let it go later. Unfortunately, in this case, I don't think they anticipated that not having it was going to cause the problems that it did. I don't want to say it would cause the problems, but I'm pretty sure not having lithium in the system was a factor.
So then, will you talk to me about when you first noticed something fell off? When did symptoms start showing up?
Well, I think the earliest symptoms just might be the sleep disturbances. I wasn't sleeping at all. Like I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, which is, I mean, let me tell you now, knowing that I have bipolar, if I don't sleep for 3 days straight, I call my doctor because something bad's going to happen. So I didn't sleep for like 3 days straight and I was tired of being pregnant and I just started thinking about cutting myself open and giving myself an auto cesarean. Now, I was thinking
Whoa.
about this at this point, okay, but that's already pretty. Usually, most women don't think about that, no matter how tired they are of being pregnant, as far as I know. And I haven't really talked to a whole lot of people about that, but when I talked to the clinicians later, the minute I mentioned that, I think they were all like flagging, whoa, postpartum psychosis here. Even though it was just a thought, I wasn't actually doing anything.
Yeah.
So the older children were there. My father was there to try to help out, because we knew there was a baby coming. So he was staying with us to help out a bit. And he cooked some sort of chicken, one of my favorite things from childhood. And My daughter decided to say that it tasted like dog poop. Well, now I still think that that's something she picked up from my mother-in-law. So
Okay.
by that point, I was having so many problems taking care of the kids between just the antepartum depression and everything else that we sent the kids to live with my in-laws for a few periods of time. And then at that point, they had just come back after living with my in-laws for a few months while I was getting the house ready to sell. So, I mean, I don't know how much stress factors into all these things.
But you were
Uh,
moving.
we were moving. We moved from Illinois to Pennsylvania. My husband was a PhD student out of funding. He was in year 7. So he had been out of funding for 2 years at that point. And we lived off of my salary. I was an accountant and his student loans. And that was it. That was all we had. And we had 2 young children, third on the way. And our daycare provider had just retired, which was another thing that freaked me out. So there was a lot of stress going on. And he was interviewing for jobs, but it was just the question of whether or not he was going to get this job. There was one that he seemed to be the lead candidate for in Pennsylvania. That meant we'd have to move. That meant we'd have to sell the house. He got it, but that meant we had to get the house ready to sell. And since he was working, that came to me, and it was so much stress on top of the pregnancy, on top of everything else, that I couldn't handle the kids. So we sent the kids to live with his parents for a bit while I got the house ready to sell. By the time this all was happening, we'd moved and we were in Pennsylvania. The kids came back to live with us. The second or third day that the kids were here, my dad was making chicken, and my oldest was like, "It tastes like dog poop." And I think at a different point in my life, had I not already been probably on the way up there, like on the way into the psychosis, I would have been a little upset, but not nearly as upset as I ended up being. So the next day I was being seen weekly by the OB at that point. And I went to my OB appointment, and I think that was my due date, or maybe the day before my due date. And the OB said, okay, not tomorrow, but the day after, call the office, tell them that you've gone over your due date, and then they do whatever they do at the point. On my way home, I decided to go to the Home Goods, which was in the same plaza as my doctor's office, and purchased a set of like dog food dishes. We didn't have a dog, but essentially, my daughter, having said that this tastes like dog poop, had triggered something in me that made me think, okay, I need to make her eat out of dog food dishes until she realizes that food is food and, like dog poop is dog poop.
Yeah.
And in the back of this, there is still the fact that, like my former mother-in-law and I had always a very turbulent relationship. And I remember she once said that some miso soup smelled like cat piss. So I kind of made the connection that my daughter had learned that sort of language from her. But again, like years later, I'm looking at all this and I'm realizing this is so extraordinarily extreme. Like this is not what I do. This is not me. At the time, no, there was no sort of like there was nothing saying, "Hey, Trish, this is a little out there." I got back home and had some sort of a fight with my husband, probably about the dog poop thing or the dog dishes thing. I don't know. And that fight escalated enough that I grabbed the large kitchen knife and I did try to start cutting myself
Wow.
to get the baby out. He was a football player, like he went to college on football money. So he was probably twice, maybe 2.5 times my size, and it's not hard for him to wrestle a knife out of my hand. So he did that. I had a prescription for Valium because of all the things surrounding the move, lack of funding, losing daycare, all that stuff. I was going I needed something because of all the anxiety. So my psychiatrist had prescribed Valium PRN for me. And I knew that I was in real trouble. I wasn't sleeping, and I knew I needed to sleep. And that was the only thing I had in that house that could make me sleep, or so I thought. He hid it and told me I was a junkie. And there's a lot about my ex-husband here too that, I mean, he had to deal with a lot, but he wasn't. People tend not to be their best selves when they're under a lot of stress, and he definitely was not his best self.
Mm.
But
Sounds really hard.
it was. And then so that was one more night. We're looking at 4 nights of not sleeping at this point. And then
Wait, so you wrestled in the kitchen
yes.
and had a knife,
Mm-hmm.
and then you went to bed? And
Tried to go to bed.
and he was like, "Okay, we're fine. We're not like." Talk to me about how that transition happened.
Well, he got the knife away from me, and then I don't know. I think it was just it's exhausting. It's so extremely exhausting. So I like
Totally.
broke down crying or something along the lines, and
Yeah.
I thought I'd be able to go to bed, and I mean, I didn't sleep. And so we're talking about 4 nights without sleep at this
Yeah.
point. I mean, we're in real danger zone. I don't remember a whole lot of what happened the next day until we were fighting in the kitchen again. I remember trying to get a hold of the kitchen scissors because I just wanted to cut some paper up. I wasn't trying to harm anyone. I just wanted to cut some paper up because I just wanted to destroy something, which in itself, the wanting to destroy something, kind of not, again, something's
Like
clearly
messed up.
wrong. One thing happened and another thing happened, and I don't remember how it happened, but he threw me out the kitchen door onto the driveway, and I landed on my belly, and that's when my water broke.
Ah.
And that's when I knew I was in labor. Before that, I had no idea that I was in labor. Historically, the one time prior to that I'd gone into labor was with my older daughter. And with her, I had premature rupture of membranes. They had to give me a fair bit of Pitocin to get me to have any contractions with her. So it's not surprising that I wasn't at all aware that I was in labor until my water broke. He'd
Okay.
called EMS as soon as he threw me out the door. I
Okay.
was rampaging around the yard. I remember muttering something along the lines of, "It's the only logical explanation." And I think I was still being bothered by the fact that my daughter had said that the chicken tasted like dog poop. So the only logical explanation was that my mother-in-law had taught her that sort of language. I'm clearly still being bothered by that. I'm muttering it repeatedly. I'm definitely not at all with it. And when EMS showed up, I'm told that they found me taking a circular saw to a plastic trash can. I have a very vague recollection of this. I mean, it's
Okay.
faint, and I almost wonder if our minds kind of block out the most extreme parts of these experiences to protect ourselves in the future. But at that point, I had a pretty bad scrape on my elbow from when my husband had thrown me onto the asphalt. I don't remember what they were saying. They sounded pretty condescending, but since I told them my water had broken, they loaded me up into the ambulance and took me to the nearest hospital, which was not where my OB had his practice privileges. And it was not as nice of hospital.
Not your established provider.
Definitely not my established provider, but they have to take you to the nearest hospital, so fine. I went there, and the doctor asked me about the scrape on my arm. And I said, well, I scraped my arm when my husband threw me out onto the driveway. And my husband had gotten into the car and followed the ambulance to the hospital. And he walked in the door at just that moment and said, yeah, I'm that husband. And one of the things that still bothers me all these years later is that, the EMS, they're mandatory reporters. And they saw the scrape, and I told them that, he'd thrown me out onto the driveway. The doctor in the ER was a mandatory reporter, and he had not only my telling him that my husband had thrown me out onto the driveway, but my husband himself admitting it. And somehow neither of them did anything. There was one time when I was pregnant with the second, when things were really bad, that my husband had slapped me, and he'd called EMS thinking that they were going to take me to the psychiatric unit, which they ultimately did, but they also arrested him because when they asked me what was with, like the slap mark on my face, I said, well, he slapped me. And so, well, there you go. He gets arrested. I go off to the psychiatric unit. So it was very different to go to Pennsylvania and suddenly no one seems to care about the fact that he threw his pregnant wife onto the asphalt. Still bothers me. It's been almost 8 years, but that still bothers me.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Trisha,
Yeah,
that you went
well,
through
I
that.
mean, it's a long time ago now, and so, I mean, obviously, I was fine, the baby was fine, in the end, and so maybe all's well no, there's absolutely zero excuse for it.
Well, especially when you say that, like, you didn't really get to see your kids after
No,
you went to the psych ward, and even
no,
though you were thrown out, like, you didn't have custody.
no.
That feels really hard.
All right, Meg here. I want to echo her point that domestic violence is not the answer. It's not okay. Unfortunately, in the US, crime reports show about 1 in 5 homicide victims. So that would be any person who is killed by another person. So 1 in 5 of these people are killed by an intimate partner. And for female victims, over half of them are killed by a current or former male intimate partner. So this is just absolutely not okay. And it is preventable. It starts with building safe communities, teaching healthy emotional expression, and standing up for one another. On mandatory reporting, apparently child abuse approaches are pretty standard across the United States anyway. However, reporting policy varies by state and even county within a state on domestic abuse. There's just less consistency on approach based on your region. So emergency responders may or may not report it, unfortunately, which is kind of crazy. But you can. If you are experiencing domestic violence, please know there are resources for you. I'll link the domestic violence hotline as well as the maternal mental health hotline in the show notes. And if you notice abuse in your community, please seek help. If someone's in immediate danger, of course, you can use 911 or a local emergency services number. If that's not the case, you can tactfully ask if someone needs help. You could share a hotline for your area. And often there are also local programs and resources or shelters even that people could utilize. All right, back to Trisha.
It took me many years to get over it and a lot of therapy. There's psychiatry and there's therapy. You need psychiatry to deal with the neurological side of things, right? Something's off, something needs to be solved, and however that's solved, it varies by person. Psychiatry gets you back to being who you really are, right? Therapy is really necessary to help you deal with the repercussions because you can't take back what you did. Doesn't matter that you're really not in control of things, which is what I later learned, that no, I didn't have any agency. My free will was very, very seriously impaired if it was there at all. Therapy kind of helps you realize that everything that happened, everything that you may or may not have done, even though it's not really your fault, you still have to learn to forgive yourself for it. Because it still has consequences, whether or not you meant for them to happen. And usually we didn't mean those consequences to happen. So, long-term consequence of all of this for me was I don't know if this tends to happen or if it's just the progression of the disease. The bipolar eventually got worse, bad enough that I stopped working. So these days, I don't work much. I work a little bit of retail because disability. I have SSDI, which is my primary source of income. It doesn't pay me quite enough for me to survive. I don't get any support from my ex-husband. I never did. There was a long time when the baby was born and I was in the maternity ward, and the psychosis symptoms were slowly abating at that point. He told me that he was taking the kids to live with his parents and that we needed to separate for a while. For a while, I thought that if I played nice and if I got myself some therapy, and he told me if I got myself some therapy and I changed, then we could get back together. I asked him what changes was he looking for. I didn't think I was exactly that bad of a person. And he said that he'll know it when he sees it. He never told me what it was.
Very vague.
Yeah, that's very vague. And we did go to marriage counseling for a while. I let him choose the counselor. I let him make the appointments because it was his schedule that was more demanding. But he stopped making the appointments after a while because he said that it didn't seem like it was going anywhere. At this point, I was still working under the assumption that if I played nice, if I did everything right, that it would all be a bad dream, that we could get the family back together, that I'd have my kids with me again. And I forget what it was. I think it's when his grandmother died. And he told me not to go to her funeral. That was like, I think that was when I finally snapped and realized, no, I've been pretty effectively kicked out of the family. And then a few months after that, it was when he finally graduated with that blessed PhD of his. He told me not to go to the graduation. Now that actually like was a little bit more of a slap in the face because I did have his bibliography.
Hmm.
And so
That's really hard.
yeah, I was like, well, I'm not going to say your dissertation is mine, but I did work on it. It was very invalidating. In the meantime, I was actually going to therapy. I found a DBT program,
What's
and
DBT?
dialectical behavioral therapy. It was designed for people with borderline personality disorder, which I certainly had symptoms of. Although my therapist doesn't like to use that term because the stigma against borderline personality disorder is really even worse than the stigma against postpartum psychosis.
Really?
And it really comes to emotional dysregulation. In my case, I didn't really know what emotions were because I was always told to repress them when I was young. Borderline personality disorder, from what I'm told, arises in cases of continuous, intense trauma at a very young age. I didn't really think I was that traumatized as a child, but I did have very, very strict parents who were certainly very invalidating the way that they raised me. So I'm sure that's part of it. My choice of husband, in the end, he has some pretty strong narcissistic tendencies. Narcissists tend to attract people who are borderline around them because they're easy to take advantage of. My mother has some strong narcissistic tendencies. Narcissistic parents tend to have borderline children. So maybe the borderline diagnosis is right, but in all these diagnoses, it's like borderline is something you cannot medicate away.
Hmm.
Bipolar is something you cannot therapize away. They're
Okay, opposite.
pretty much, you need medication to treat bipolar. There's really no way around it. You might need less medication or more medication, depending on who you are, depending on particular case, but you need medication to treat it. It's not something you can just like train yourself to overcome. You can't train yourself to avoid the mania. You can't train yourself to avoid the depression. There are risk factors that go into each of those, but in the end, it's medication that will keep things stable. And we're really lucky that we have medication.
Right.
Science is great. They've come out with all these medications that I take 7 medications a day, 7 prescription medications a day. It's a lot. I don't like to take them all. That's the bipolar for you. I've accepted it because, I have a good life. I really do. The situation with my children is frustrating, yes, but they're getting older, and one day they'll understand that, as the movie Frozen teaches us, people make bad choices when they're mad or scared or stressed.
I watched that this weekend.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact is that my ex-husband was certainly in all of that very mad and very scared
Yeah.
and very stressed. And while I don't agree with all his actions, I understand because all these years later, he's still scared. He might not be so mad and he might not be so stressed anymore, but he's still scared. And so that's why I still only have 2 hours every 2 weeks with my children in a supervised visitation center. And I have to drive 5 hours each way, like to go see them. It's not fair, but fair was never part of the equation.
I'm curious about your experience as you navigated postpartum and
hmm
like custody disputes.
So Pennsylvania is a bifurcated state. You can deal with custody separately than divorce. The custody dispute started first, and he wanted sole custody, sole physical, sole legal. Basically, cut me out of the equation more or less entirely. I did manage to find an attorney. Custody cases always follow the children. So we're still dealing with Pennsylvania, but it was an attorney that could practice in those courts that would have mattered. I did manage to find one through some friends out here. Attorneys are expensive. And frankly, the best working years I had, I gave to him. I was supporting him when he ran out of funds for his PhD program. And I was working here, but a good chunk of the money I made, I sent to him for child support because the children lived with him, and therefore I had an obligation to pay child support.
Okay, wow.
I made enough of an agreement with him to send it to him directly because that was the last little bit of agency I had. You know, if I had been more passive aggressive, I would have sent him checks and written in the memo line like ransom or, like you dick or something like that. Not quite that passive aggressive, but I came to accept it. These days, because I have Social Security disability, he gets Social Security on behalf of my account for the kids.
Oh.
And what he gets from Social Security is more than I was paying him in child support, so he can't complain.
Huh.
But I ran out of money to pay my attorney a long, long time ago. It went on for years, but realistically, I think by the end of it, I'd probably paid like 30 grand, not counting what my parents had helped me pay. And I just felt I was basically bankrupt. And I love my kids. I really do. But I need to have a roof over my head too.
Right.
And when it came down between those two choices, I have to choose the roof over my head.
What are some things that you're proud what would your then self not believe in your today life?
I bought a house and managed to screw over the banking system while I was at it. Or maybe not screw over, that sounds wrong. I bought a house before I was technically divorced. It was my income, it was my house, like he had nothing to do with it. And the bank originally wanted him to sign off on an affidavit saying that all marital debts and liabilities had been settled, there were no support obligations on either side. And I was like, well, he didn't know that I was working, so I didn't exactly want to release that affidavit to him. And then I was like, how is this okay? This is the 21st century. How is it that I have to ask my husband for permission to buy a house with my money? And then I did some research and found, no, it's not okay. They cannot ask me that. So I sent in a complaint to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I get an email from the Fed asking me if I'd be able to take a conference call with them at some point. I was like, okay, sure. I thought it would just be, like two members of middle management somewhere. No, I get on this conference call and they all go around the room and there's like 10 people there in this room and they're all like, like chief compliance officer. And I'm like, whoa, okay. They take it pretty seriously. They did some investigation and decided that the bank had actually violated the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which was written to prevent marital status discrimination. And I was like, wow, that felt pretty good. I took on bed banking and I won.
I'm so glad. Cheers to you and your house. Final note, what advice would you give to someone who's recently experienced postpartum psychosis?
Things may not be okay, but you will be okay. And that's a very important distinction to remember.
I love that. Okay, thank you so much.
All right.
Lovely. I just so appreciate you sharing all of this.
Yeah, thanks for doing this project. I mean, it's really ambitious, but I think it's a good project to do.
Yeah, hoping it comes together beautifully. Thank you, Trisha. Have a lovely day.
Yeah, thanks. You too.
Wow. I'm inspired by Trisha's optimism and resilience and her wisdom around these topics. She is a wealth of knowledge, and I really felt honored to hear her story and be able to have this interview on the podcast. I asked her a few follow-up questions over email, and she reiterated how essential medication and a strong clinician relationship have been for her mental health today. As you can hear in this interview, she is an active participant in her health and treatment journey. She shared an approach of being a PITA patient, that stands for pain in the ass patient, someone who asks questions, advocates for yourself, gets second opinions, and shops around for clinicians to find a really good fit. I love that. +1 to that. be an active participant and don't be afraid to ask questions and pause and go deeper to really understand what's going on. I also admired her note on designing your life to support wellness. She left a high-stress career and moved to more part-time work that has worked for her and has been impactful for her mental health. Apparently, there is some merit or something to keep an eye out for when managing bipolar that I didn't know. She mentioned keeping an eye out for diabetes and thyroid dysregulation and using some medications for those things along the way. So we'll have to explore that down the road. Trisha made it clear that for her, the key is not just being medicated, but being correctly medicated through strong, trusting relationships with her clinicians. This was a moving story for me. I was filled with both gratitude for my partner who was so supportive through the experience, and also frustration and feeling a bit distraught at how things were for Trisha, and feeling sad about her ex-husband and how things panned out. If you, like me, feel compelled to do something, one thing I found is Mind the Gap, a charity focused on increasing research awareness and access to screening, diagnosis, and treatment of perinatal mental health disorders. If you're able to, donating is one way to have an impact. I also found a resource through Postpartum Support International that was started by Andrea Yates' legal team. It's the Legal Justice Program. So this is for families who have court system involvement in the aftermath of their postpartum or perinatal mood disorders. So if you know someone or are personally affected or facing legal involvement, there are ways to get additional resources. You can submit a form and share details of your experience and see what they could do to support you. On a personal note, when I was treated for postpartum psychosis, I was told in the general psych ward, I was in a general inpatient psych ward, I was told that the only thing we really understood was that postpartum psychosis was somehow linked to bipolar. We didn't know much, but that's one thing we understood. And that left me with some lingering questions like, well, what really is bipolar? Do I have it? Does postpartum psychosis always connect to it? And I feel Trisha helped deepen my understanding of what bipolar can look like. And then hearing her reflections on diagnosis and treatment was insightful and instructive for me. Hopefully it was helpful for you too. Just a reminder to take care of yourselves and each other. Be kind to your mind. And thanks for listening.